2 years had passed since the humans departed, and the galaxy had become a different place. The old Galactic Council that had ruled for 10,000 years no longer existed in the form it once had. 3 of the 12 elder species had withdrawn entirely, unable to manage their territories without the human infrastructure they had depended on for so long. 2 others had collapsed into civil war when their populations discovered the truth about how the Council had treated humanity. The remaining 7 species had been forced to rebuild everything from the ground up. Councillor Methys had been elected as the new speaker after Valtteri resigned in disgrace, his role in the exploitation directive having been exposed by journalists who finally had access to classified archives. Her first act as speaker was to abolish the weighted voting system that had kept younger species powerless for millennia. From this day forward, she announced at her inauguration, every member of this council will have an equal voice, regardless of how long their species has traveled among the stars. The reforms that followed were painful and slow, but they were real. Dangerous assignments were no longer given only to species that the council considered expendable, and instead, every member nation took turns sending their people to difficult postings. Frontier colonies received the same resources and protection as core worlds, and the policies that had concentrated wealth and safety in the hands of elder species were dismantled one by one. And for the first time in galactic history, council representatives left their comfortable chambers and went to see the reality of life in the territories they governed. Councillor Yeşil spent 6 months living on a border station that humans had once protected, learning firsthand what it meant to face danger without the safety of distance. Young Kethra traveled to the Velen trade corridor and helped negotiate a new peace between species that had returned to war after the human mediators departed. Even Councillor Dreven, whose arrogance had once seemed unshakable, was changed by what he witnessed when he visited the Yunith homeworld and saw the graves of millions who had died from the plague that human researchers had been trying to cure. I told myself that we were the superior species, he admitted to a gathering of journalists upon his return. But I watched the Yunith bury their children, and I knew that our superiority had been nothing but a story we told ourselves to justify taking more than we gave. Slowly, word of these changes reached the humans in their distant refuge. The first sign came when a human trading vessel appeared at the edge of council space, not to settle or work, but simply to observe. Then a small delegation of human diplomats attended a minor summit as unofficial observers, taking notes but refusing to participate in discussions. Communication channels that had been silent for 2 years began carrying occasional messages, brief and formal but present. And then, 80 months after the delegation had visited the memorial, an invitation arrived from human space. Ambassador Yoon Seoha requested that the archivist make one final journey to meet with the new generation of human leaders who would decide humanity's future relationship with the galaxy. The archivist traveled alone, their ancient body failing but their minds still sharp. They were received not in a government building or a formal chamber, but in a simple room overlooking a garden where human children played under a simulated sky. Yoon Seoha was there, along with younger humans who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who knew their own worth. "You came," the old ambassador said, echoing her words from their first meeting at the memorial. "I had to," the archivist replied. "I wanted to see what you had built before I die." Yoon Seoha smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. "We have built a home," she said. "For the first time since we joined the galactic community, our people have a place where they are not defined by their usefulness to others." She gestured to the children playing in the garden. "These children will grow up knowing that they have value simply because they exist. She continued, not because of what they can do for species that consider themselves superior. The archivist watched the children for a long moment before speaking. The council has changed. They said finally, "We have begun to learn what you always knew, that civilization is not built by those who rule, but by those who serve, and we were too proud to see it before." "We know," Yunseoha replied. "We have been watching." She moved closer to the ancient being and placed a gentle hand on their arm. "That is why I invited you here," she said. "Not to hear promises or negotiations, but to tell you that we have decided to try again." The archivist's eyes widened with surprise. "You will return?" "They asked, and not as we were," Yunseoha said firmly. "We will never again accept a role as servants to those who see themselves as our betters." She looked out at the garden where the children were now gathering around. A young human who was telling them a story about the stars. "But we will work alongside you," she continued. "As partners and equals, if you can accept us as such." The archivist bowed their head. "We will try," they said. "I cannot promise that old habits will die quickly, but the will to change is real." 3 months later, the first joint human council vessel launched from Nexus Prime. It was called the New Beginning, and its mission was to travel to the outer territories where species had been ignored by the old council for centuries. The crew was mixed. Humans and aliens working side by side in a way that had never truly happened before. At the helm stood a young human captain named Yu Minha, the granddaughter of the ambassador who had walked out of the council chamber 3 years earlier. Beside her was a Kethri first officer named Veth, who had once served under Speaker Velthary and had volunteered for this mission as a way of honoring the changes his generation had fought to achieve. "Are you ready?" Minha asked as the ship prepared to jump to hyperspace. Veth turned to look at her, and something in his compound eyes might have been the beginning of respect. "We are learning to be," he answered. The ship's engines powered up, and the stars stretched into lines of light as the new beginning accelerated toward the unknown behind them. The galaxy continued its slow transformation. It would take generations to undo the damage of 10,000 years of arrogance and exploitation. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when the old ways seemed impossible to overcome, but for the first time in galactic history, the work was being done not by those who were forced to serve, but by those who chose to build something better. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, in a small room overlooking a garden where children played, an old woman named Yunseoha watched a broadcast of the New Beginning's launch and allowed herself to hope. The humans had departed in silence, forcing the council to face its deeds. And now, at last, the galaxy was learning to listen. 8 months after the departure, a small vessel carrying 5 council representatives jumped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system where humanity had gathered. The delegation had been chosen carefully. After weeks of debate, Councillor Yashel had volunteered immediately, driven by the guilt of her discoveries. Councillor Methys came because she had once considered herself a friend to humanity and wanted to understand what had gone wrong. Speaker Velthary attended because protocol demanded the presence of the council's highest authority. A young Kethri diplomat named Kethra joined them to represent the newer generation of council species, and the archivist came despite their advanced age, saying only that they needed to witness this moment before their long life finally ended. The journey to human space took them through regions that had once been busy with traffic and commerce. Now those regions were empty. They passed stations that humans had built and maintained, now dark and cold without power. They flew over colonies where humans and aliens had lived side by side, now abandoned and silent. They saw the remnants of patrol routes that human vessels had traveled for decades, keeping peace in territories that no one else wanted to protect. I did not realize how much of this was theirs, Kethra said quietly as they passed yet another abandoned outpost. I grew up believing that the Council maintained order in these regions. The Council took credit for it, the archivist replied. But the work was done by human hands. When they finally arrived at the coordinates, they found something none of them had expected. Thousands of human vessels floated in orbit around a small, lifeless moon, their lights creating a constellation of humanity in the darkness of space. But these were not warships gathered for battle. They were civilian transports and colony ships and personal vessels, carrying families and communities who had come to this remote place for reasons the delegation did not yet understand. And on the surface of the moon below, a vast structure rose from the barren rock. It was a memorial unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Names were carved into black stone walls that stretched for kilometers, each name representing a human who had died in service to the Galactic Council. There were soldiers and doctors and scientists and diplomats. There were engineers who had died repairing stations in dangerous conditions. There were teachers who had given their lives protecting students during raids. There were farmers who had starved on frontier colonies so that others might eat. The delegation landed their vessel near the memorial's entrance, where a small group of humans waited to receive them. At the center of that group stood Ambassador Yoon Seoha, her hair now completely gray and her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes as sharp and clear as they had been on the day she walked out of the council chamber. You came, she said simply. We had to, Speaker Velthury replied. The galaxy is falling apart without you, and we need to understand what we can do to bring you back. Yoon Seoha nodded slowly and gestured for the delegation to follow her. She led them through the memorial in silence, past walls of names that seemed to go on forever, past statues depicting humans in moments of sacrifice and courage, past gardens where flowers from Earth grew in carefully maintained biodomes. Do you know how many names are on these walls? She asked finally. No one answered. 417,000, Yoon Seoha said. 417,000 humans who died in service to the Galactic Council over 200 years. She stopped in front of a section of wall where the names were carved more recently. This section contains the names of those who died in the last decade alone. She continued, 32,000 people, and most of them were younger than I am now. Counselor Methys reached out with one feathered hand to touch the cold stone. We did not know, she whispered. You did not want to know, Yoon Seoha replied, her voice carrying no anger, but also no forgiveness. Every year we submitted reports documenting our losses. And every year, those reports were filed away without discussion. She turned to face the delegation directly. For 200 years, we believed that if we worked hard enough, you would eventually see us as equals, she said. We took every assignment you gave us, and we died in every dangerous place you sent us. And we told ourselves that someday our sacrifice would be recognized. Her voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, the diplomat who had maintained perfect composure through decades of negotiations looked simply tired. We were wrong, she continued. You never saw our service as evidence of our worth, and instead, you saw it as confirmation of your superiority. Because what advanced species would accept such treatment unless they were naturally inferior? Speaker Velthury stepped forward. Ambassador, I want to apologize on behalf of... No, Yoon Seoha interrupted. I did not bring you here to hear apologies. And words cannot undo what has been done. She gestured to the memorial around them. I brought you here so you could see what your policies cost us, she said. So you could understand why we left, and so you could make a choice about what happens next. What choice? Yashil asked. Yoon Seoha was silent for a long moment before answering. We are not leaving forever, she said finally. Humanity does not abandon those in need, even when those in need have treated us badly. She looked at each member of the delegation in turn. "But we will not return to what was," she continued. "We will not send our children to die for a council that sees them as tools. And we will not rebuild systems that were designed to exploit us." "Then what do you want?" Valtteri asked. Yunseoa smiled, but there was no joy in it. "We want you to prove that you can be better," she said. "We want you to build a galaxy where our children will be treated as equals. Not because they have earned it through sacrifice, but because equality is the right of all thinking beings." She turned and began walking back toward the entrance of the memorial. "When you can show us such a galaxy," she called over her shoulder, "find us again." The delegation returned to their vessel in silence as they lifted off from the surface of the moon. The archivist looked down at the memorial one last time. She did not ask for anything, the ancient being observed. "No reparations, and no guarantees, and no promises." "No," Counselor Yashel agreed. "She simply asked us to become worthy of their return." And as the vessel jumped back to hyperspace, every member of the delegation understood that the real work was only beginning. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had seen many historic moments in its 10,000 years of existence, but none quite like this one. Ambassador Yun Seoha rose from her seat without warning during what had been an ordinary session about trade routes and border disputes, and the other members of the human delegation rose with her in perfect unison. The movement was so sudden and so synchronized that Speaker Valtteri paused mid-sentence, his mandibles clicking together in confusion as he watched the humans stand. Yun Seoha was a small woman by galactic standards, barely reaching the chest of most council species. But she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had earned her respect over 3 decades of service. She did not speak. She did not look at any of the 12 counselors who sat in their elevated positions around the circular chamber. Instead, she simply placed a small data crystal on the polished table before her, turned, and walked toward the exit. The other humans followed her in a single file, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the chamber. Counselor Dreven of the Morth hegemony let out a sharp laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "What is the meaning of this performance?" he demanded, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture of mockery. "Are the humans finally showing their true nature as dramatic children?" No one answered him. The humans continued walking, their faces calm and composed, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Speaker Valtteri rose from his seat, his insectoid body towering over the others, as he called out in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "Ambassador Yun, I demand an explanation for this breach of protocol, and you will return to your seat immediately." Yun Seoha did not pause or turn around. She simply kept walking. And the last human in line closed the great doors behind them with a soft click that seemed louder than any explosion. For a long moment, no one in the council chamber moved. The 12 counselors looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance to something that might have been the first stirrings of concern. "They will return," said Counselor Mathis of the Sylphan Collective, a feathered crest rippling with uncertainty. "Humans are emotional creatures, and this is surely some form of protest that will pass within hours." But hours passed, and the humans did not return. Reports began coming in from across council space, each one more alarming than the last. The human embassy on Nexus Prime had been emptied completely, with every piece of equipment and every personal belonging removed as if the humans had never been there at all. Human trade vessels were jumping to hyperspace in coordinated waves, leaving their assigned routes and heading for destinations unknown. Communication channels that had been open for 2 centuries suddenly went silent, with every frequency the humans had used going dark within a single standard day. Counselor Yashel of the Harath Dominion was the first to access the data crystal Yun Seoa had left behind. It projected a simple hologram into the air above the council table. A set of coordinates in a remote system far beyond council space. And a single phrase in the human language that translated roughly as "we leave you to yourselves." What does this mean? Asked Councillor Thren of the Vox Assembly, his gelatinous body quivering with what might have been anxiety. Are they declaring war upon us? No, said a voice from the far end of the chamber. Everyone turned to look at the oldest member of the council, a being so ancient that no one remembered what species they had originally been. They were known simply as the Archivist, and they had served the council for longer than most civilizations had existed. The Archivist moved forward slowly, their robes trailing behind them like shadows. "This is not a declaration of war," the Archivist said, their voice carrying the weight of countless centuries. "If the humans wanted war, they would have given speeches about their grievances, and they would have made demands that we could accept or reject. Then what is it?" Speaker Velthary asked. The Archivist was silent for a long moment before answering. "They did not leave in anger," the ancient being said finally. "They left in grief, and that is far worse." Councillor Dreven made a dismissive sound with his throat membranes. "Grief over what?" He scoffed. "We have given the humans everything, including access to our technology and protection within our borders, and opportunities that their primitive species could never have achieved alone. Have we?" the Archivist asked, and something in their tone made even Dreven fall silent. "Or have we simply told ourselves that story for so long that we have forgotten to question whether it is true?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a fire in the days that followed. The full scope of the human departure became clear. Every human vessel in council space had left every human colony within council borders, had been evacuated. Every human, scientist and doctor and engineer and diplomat and soldier had simply packed their belongings and disappeared into the vast darkness. Between stars they had not attacked anyone. They had not stolen anything. They had not even said goodbye to the countless aliens they had worked alongside for generations. They had simply stopped existing in council space as completely as if they had never been there at all. Let them go, Councillor Dreven declared at the emergency session called 3 days after the departure. "The humans were useful, but they were never essential. And we managed this galaxy for 10,000 years before they arrived." Many of the other councillors nodded in agreement. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 200 years, which was barely a blink of an eye in the grand history of the elder species. What could one young species possibly contribute that the ancient civilizations could not provide for themselves? But the Archivist said nothing. The ancient being simply sat in their seat and watched the other councillors with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of countless empires. And in that silence, there was a warning that no one wanted to hear, because the truth was that no one had ever bothered to count exactly how many tasks the humans had taken on over those 200 years. No one had tracked how many disputes they had mediated, or how many disasters they had responded to, or how many systems they had maintained. The humans had always been there, quiet and reliable and willing to do whatever needed to be done, and now they were gone in the weeks to come. The council would learn exactly what that absence meant. But on that first night, as the stars shone cold and distant through the windows of the empty chamber, most of the councillors simply went to sleep, believing that nothing had really changed. They would soon discover how wrong they were. 6 months had passed since the departure, and the Galactic Council had become a place of fear and accusation. Councillor Yashil of the Harath Dominion stood before the assembled representatives with a stack of documents that had taken her staff 3 months to compile. "I demanded a full accounting of every council decision regarding humanity," she announced, her scaled face showing none of the contempt she had once displayed toward the humans. What I found has convinced me that we are facing not just a political crisis, but a moral reckoning. She activated the holographic display, and the chamber filled with records that stretch back 2 centuries, when humans first made contact with the greater galactic community. They were welcomed as a curious novelty. Yashel began, a young species from a small world, eager to learn and willing to work hard for acceptance. The display showed images from those early days. Human ambassadors in simple clothes meeting with towering alien dignitaries. Human scientists studying technologies that seemed like magic to them. Human soldiers training alongside warriors from species that had conquered stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. We assigned them mentors from our own species. Yashel continued. We taught them our languages and our customs and our laws. And we congratulated ourselves on our generosity toward these primitive newcomers. Her voice hardened, but I have found records showing that those mentorships were designed to identify which humans would be most useful in which roles. And the assignments that followed were not opportunities given out of kindness, but rather calculated placements to extract maximum value from human labor. Counselor Dreven shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Every species must prove its worth, he said defensively. The humans were given chances that many others never received, were they? Yashel responded, let me show you what those chances looked like. The display changed to show a list of assignments given to humans over 200 years. Frontier settlement in the Drath Wastes. Yashel read, 17 human colonies established in a region prone to solar flares and asteroid impacts. And the survival rate for the first generation was 43%. She moved to the next entry, peacekeeping deployment in the Naxos conflict, where human soldiers were placed between 2 armies that had been fighting for 1,000 years. And they lost 8,000 troops in the first decade alone. And the next, medical response to the Velthari plague, where human doctors worked in contaminated zones that other species refused to enter. And 200 researchers died before a cure was found. The list went on and on, filling the chamber with evidence of sacrifice after sacrifice that the humans had made in service to species that barely acknowledged their existence. And what did they receive in return? Yashel asked, her voice rising with anger that surprised even herself. They were denied voting rights for 50 years. And when those rights were finally granted, their votes were weighted at half the value of elder species. That policy was changed. Speaker Velthari protested 20 years ago. Yashel shot back. After humans had already given us a century and a half of service, and even then, the change only came because a human diplomat managed to embarrass the council into action by publishing a comparison of our voting records. The archivist nodded slowly from their seat in the corner. I remember that incident. The ancient being said, the council was furious, and several members demanded that the diplomat be expelled from council space. But the humans protected her. Yashel continued. They threatened to withdraw their peacekeeping forces from 14 active conflicts unless the council agreed to treat her publication as a legitimate policy proposal. And for once, they won. She turned to face Counselor Dreven directly. Do you know what happened to that diplomat afterward? She asked. Dreven said nothing. She was reassigned to a border station in the outer territories. Yashel answered. And 3 years later, she died defending that station from raiders that the council had refused to address. Despite repeated warnings, the chamber fell silent. Her name was Park Jian, Yashel said quietly. And she was one of hundreds of human leaders who died serving a council that never respected them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Counselor Methus raised her hand slowly. I did not know these things, she said, a voice barely above a whisper. I believed that the humans were grateful for the opportunities we provided, and I thought their willingness to serve was evidence of their admiration for our civilizations. We all believed that, Yashel replied. because believing it was easier than asking questions. She deactivated the holographic display and faced the council with eyes that held something close to shame. But the worst discovery was not the exploitation itself. She continued. It was the directive the archivist mentioned, and what that directive reveals about our true intentions. She pulled up a single document. Its text projected large enough for everyone to read. The directive had been issued 80 years ago by a committee of senior counselors, including several who still held their seats today. Its language was cold and bureaucratic, but its meaning was unmistakable. Humans were to be encouraged to take dangerous assignments because their short lifespans meant they could be replaced more quickly than members of longer-lived species. They were to be kept politically weak because their rapid population growth made them a potential threat to the established order, and they were to be praised publicly for their service while being denied the rewards that service would have earned any other species. We did not stumble into exploitation, Yashil concluded. We planned it, and we executed it. And we maintained it for generations while telling ourselves and the humans that we were doing them a favor. Counselor Dreven finally broke the silence that followed. Even if all of this is true, he said slowly, what does it matter now that the humans are gone? And what can we possibly do to change what has already happened? The archivist rose from their seat and moved to stand beside Yashil. We can begin by admitting what we did, the ancient being said, not to the humans, but to ourselves, because until we acknowledge the truth, we cannot begin to change. Change into what? Speaker Velthary asked before anyone could answer. The young Kethri, communications officer, entered the chamber again with another report. The human fleet at the coordinates has stopped moving, she announced. They have constructed something on the surface of a moon in that system, and our long-range sensors have identified it as some kind of monument. A monument to what? Methys asked. The officer hesitated before answering. We believe it is a memorial, she said finally. Our analysts have identified the structure as similar to the monuments humans built to honor their dead. And in that moment, every counselor understood that the humans had not simply left to escape exploitation. They had left to grieve for everything they had lost in service to a galaxy that had never truly valued them. The question now was whether the council had the courage to face them and admit the truth. 3 months had passed since the humans departed, and the galaxy was beginning to fall apart. The first crisis came from the Velen Trade Corridor, a network of shipping routes that connected 17 different species who had been bitter enemies for thousands of years before humanity arrived. The humans had somehow convinced these ancient rivals to put aside their hatred and work together for mutual profit. And human diplomats had served as neutral mediators for every transaction and dispute that arose along those routes. Without them, old wounds reopened within days. The Velen people accused the Korthi merchants of cheating them on cargo weights. The Korthi accused the Velen of sabotaging their vessels by the end of the first month. Shots had been fired, and by the end of the second month, full-scale warfare had erupted across a region that had known peace for nearly a century. Counselor Methys brought the report to the emergency council session with trembling hands. We have lost contact with 14 trading stations, she announced, her feathered crest lying flat against her skull in distress. The death toll is already in the hundreds of thousands, and neither side will agree to negotiations unless a neutral party can be found. Then find a neutral party, Counselor Dreven snapped. We have dozens of species in this council, and surely one of them can serve as mediator. But that was the problem. Every species in the council had old alliances or ancient grudges that made them unacceptable to one side or the other. The humans had been trusted precisely because they were outsiders with no stake in the conflicts. Of the past, they had been fair because they had no reason to be anything. Else no one could replace them. The second crisis came from the Paxes cluster, where a 100-year peace treaty collapsed overnight when the human peacekeeping force withdrew the Kethri had signed. That treaty with the Morth hegemony, under the Fury, guaranteed that human soldiers would patrol the border and prevent either side from cheating. Without those patrols, both sides immediately began moving troops into contested zones. Speaker Velthary himself was forced to travel to the region to prevent all-out war between two of the most powerful species in the Council. He succeeded only by threatening to have the Council declare both nations rogue states, and even then, the peace he achieved was fragile and temporary. How did the humans manage this for so long? He asked the archivist upon his return, his compound eyes dulled with exhaustion. I spent 6 days doing nothing but arguing with generals and politicians, and I barely prevented a massacre. But the humans kept that peace for 100 years with a force barely a tenth the size of either army. They were respected. The archivist answered simply. Both sides knew that the humans would die to keep their word, and that made their word worth something. The third crisis was the worst of all. A plague began spreading through the Yinith homeworld, a disease that attacked the nervous system and caused slow, agonizing death over a period of weeks. Human medical researchers had been leading the containment effort for months before the departure, and they had been close to developing a treatment when they left. Their notes and research were still in the labs. They had abandoned, but no one could make sense of them. The Yinith were a proud people who had looked down on humanity as primitive newcomers. But now their leaders were reduced to begging the Council for help that no one knew how to provide. 3 million Yinith died in the first month alone. We need the humans back, Councillor Thren declared at the next emergency session, his voice quivering with something close to panic. We must send a delegation to their coordinates and demand that they return to fulfill their obligations. What obligations? The archivist asked quietly. The question brought the chamber to sudden silence. They were members of this council, Councillor Dreven said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. They had duties and responsibilities like all member species. Did they? The archivist responded, I have spent the past 3 months reviewing our records, and I have discovered some interesting facts about humanity's membership in this council. The ancient being rose slowly and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with data. The humans were denied full voting rights for their first 50 years of membership. The archivist began. They were told this was standard procedure for new species. But I can find no other example of this policy being applied so strictly. Administrative oversight, Councillor Yashel said dismissively. Perhaps, the archivist continued. But I also found records showing that human colonies were consistently assigned to frontier regions, with high rates of natural disasters and hostile wildlife, while colonies from elder species were given priority for safer core territories. The humans asked for those assignments. Councillor Methis protested. They said they wanted to prove themselves. They asked because they knew they would not be given anything better. The archivist replied, and they hoped that by accepting the dangerous work, they might eventually earn equal treatment. The holographic display shifted to show a new set of documents, but the most disturbing discovery, the archivist said, was a classified directive issued 80 years ago by this very council, and it stated explicitly that humans should be encouraged to take high risk and low prestige assignments in order to maximize their utility while limiting their political influence. The chamber erupted in protests and denials. Several councillors claimed they had never seen such a directive, while others argued that whatever policies existed had been made for good reasons. But the archivist simply stood in silence until the noise died down. We called them primitive. The ancient being said finally. We mocked their short lives and their emotional nature and their stubborn insistence on helping everyone they met. But somehow, despite all our superiority, they became essential to everything we do. Councillor Drevin slammed his 4 fists against his desk. Enough of this guilt, he shouted. The humans chose to leave, and if they want to abandon their responsibilities, then they must face the consequences. And what are those consequences? The archivist asked. We cannot force them to return, and we cannot replace what they provided, and every day they are gone. More of our galaxy crumbles into chaos. The ancient being turned to face the other counselors one by one. We did not fail to appreciate them. The archivist concluded. We exploited them deliberately and systematically for 200 years, and they knew it the entire time. And now they have decided that they will no longer accept that exploitation. Then what do we do? Speaker Veltri asked before anyone could answer. A young Kethri, communications officer, burst into the chamber with news that changed everything. We have detected anomalous activity at the coordinates the humans left. The officer reported breathlessly. Long-range scans show thousands of human vessels gathering in that system, and they are not hiding or fleeing anymore. What are they doing? The speaker demanded. The officer swallowed nervously before answering. They appear to be waiting, sir. And in that moment, every member of the council understood that the humans had not simply run away. They had made a choice. And now the council would have to make one too.